Judge Raymond Bennett's gavel hovered mid-air as his eyes locked on the tarnished bronze star pinned to James Wilson's threadbare coat. The crowded Atlanta courtroom fell silent. "Where did you get that medal, son?" the judge whispered, his hand trembling. James's eyes darkened. "Case son, 1968, where you left me behind." Isn't it fascinating how a single moment can change everything? Before we dive deeper into this powerful story of recognition and justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If this hook caught your attention, hit that like button and subscribe to catch more incredible true stories of justice and redemption. Now let's rewind to see how James Wilson, a decorated Vietnam veteran, ended up standing before the very man whose life he once saved. The bitter January wind cut through James Wilson's layers of clothing as he huddled in the doorway of an abandoned building on Auburn Avenue. At 67 years old, his body could no longer withstand Atlanta's winter nights without shelter. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, and the city's homeless shelters had reached capacity hours ago. James had tried the veterans' shelter first, watching as the staff admitted younger white veterans while telling him there was no space. "Come back tomorrow," they said, not meeting his eyes. James had seen that look too many times in his life to argue. He'd found the abandoned building by chance, a former grocery store awaiting demolition as part of the neighborhood's gentrification. The broken back window offered an entry point, and more importantly, protection from the killing cold. He'd only been inside for an hour, huddled in a corner with newspapers for insulation, when the flashlights hit his face. "Police! Don't move!" The officers entered with guns drawn, as though confronting an armed suspect rather than an elderly man seeking warmth. Officer Thomas Reeves, a stocky white man with crew-cut hair and cold eyes, approached with his weapon raised. "Hands where I can see them now." Despite James raising his hands slowly, Officer Reeves roughly spun him around, slamming him against the wall. The impact sent pain shooting through James's arthritic shoulders. "I'm just trying to stay warm, officer," James managed, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Save it," Reeves growled, wrenching James's arms back to apply handcuffs. "You people always have excuses." The cuffs bit into James's wrists as Reeves tightened them far beyond necessary. His partner, a younger officer named Daniels, looked uncomfortable, but said nothing as Reeves roughly searched James, emptying his pockets onto the dirty floor. Among James's meager possessions were his VA medication for PTSD, a worn wallet containing his military ID, and carefully folded discharge. Papers he'd kept protected in plastic for nearly 5 decades. Reeves kicked the papers aside, the plastic tearing. "Sir, those are important," James said quietly. Reeves responded by yanking him toward the door. "Shut up. You're trespassing on private property." In the police car, James listened as Reeves called in the arrest, describing him as aggressive and potentially violent, fabrications that James knew would follow him into the courtroom. At the station, they confiscated all his belongings, including his medication. When James explained he needed it for service-connected PTSD, the booking officer smirked. "Should have thought about that before breaking the law." James spent the night in a holding cell, his joints stiffening painfully in the cold concrete room. By morning, when he was brought before the court for arraignment, he could barely walk without wincing. His public defender, Lisa Chen, had 15 minutes and 17 cases that morning. She flipped through his file quickly, her eyes tired but kind. "Mr. Wilson, they're charging you with criminal trespass, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct." James shook his head. "I didn't resist anything. I was just trying not to freeze to death." Lisa studied him more carefully, noting his dignified bearing despite his circumstances. "You're a veteran?" she asked, noticing the military ID in his file. "Vietnam. 20 years service after that. Army." She nodded, making notes. "The resisting charge is ridiculous, and I'll try to get the disorderly thrown out, but the trespass might stick. Judge Bennett is presiding today. She hesitated. He can be tough. What she didn't say, what she didn't need to say, was that Judge Bennett was known throughout the Atlanta legal community for his harsh sentencing of black defendants. The statistics spoke for themselves, though the courthouse culture protected him from official censure. In the courtroom, the differences in treatment were immediately apparent. White defendants received patient hearings, with Bennett often reducing charges or offering alternatives to jail time. When James's case was called, the prosecutor, Bradley Morgan, approached the bench with confident familiarity. "Your Honor, the defendant has a pattern of lawlessness. Previous arrests for loitering, panhandling, and public intoxication. The state recommends maximum sentencing." Morgan neglected to mention that all James's previous charges stemmed directly from his homelessness, not any actual criminal intent. Judge Raymond Bennett peered down at James over reading glasses, his face showing no recognition, only contempt. "Mr. Wilson, this court is tired of repeat offenders who refuse to become productive members of society." The words stung James with their injustice. He had tried for decades to be exactly that, only to be denied at every turn. While white veterans received preferential hiring, housing assistance, and medical care, James had watched his benefits delayed, his applications rejected, his complaints ignored. The gentrification sweeping through Atlanta's historically black neighborhoods had been the final blow, pricing him out of the room he'd managed to rent for years. The courthouse security guard, a white man with a military bearing, watched James with suspicion, his hand resting near his weapon. The court clerk sighed impatiently when James spoke too softly, making him repeat himself while others in the room exchanged knowing glances. These small indignities were familiar companions to James, as constant as his combat nightmares. As the prosecutor continued outlining the case against him, James stood straight despite his pain. 50 years of systemic discrimination had not bent his spine, though it had taken nearly everything else. His military training still showed in his posture, a ghost of the proud soldier he had been before America taught him his service meant less because of his skin color. Little did he know that in a few moments, the past he carried hidden inside his coat would collide with the present, in a way no one in the courtroom could anticipate. Judge Raymond Bennett commanded his Atlanta courtroom like a general overseeing a battlefield, a comparison he would appreciate given his carefully cultivated image as a Vietnam veteran turned legal warrior. At 65, his silver hair and tailored robes projected authority, while his reputation for law and order rulings had made him a favorite among conservative political circles. This morning, he reviewed James Wilson's file with the same cursory attention he gave most cases involving homeless black defendants, already formulating his lecture on personal responsibility before he'd heard a word of testimony. 6 months earlier, Bennett had sentenced a young white businessman to community service for embezzling over $50,000, citing the man's otherwise exemplary character and momentary lapse in judgment. The previous week, he'd sentenced a black college student to 3 years for possession of marijuana, worth less than $20. Both decisions were consistent with Bennett's pattern of judicial behavior, carefully documented by the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, but dismissed by the Judicial Review Board as statistical anomalies. Lisa Chen had seen this pattern play out countless times. As James's public defender, she knew their best hope lay in humanizing her client before Bennett could reduce him to another statistic. "Your Honor, if I may, Mr. Wilson is a decorated Vietnam veteran who served honorably for over 2 decades. Bennett cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Counsel, his military service, if verified, is commendable but irrelevant to the charges before this court. We have many veterans who don't break the law." The dismissal was typical of Bennett's courtroom style, a performance of impartiality that masked his predetermined conclusions. From her seat behind the court reporter's desk, Amara Jackson noticed the interaction with practiced attention. At 29, she had spent 3 years documenting the disparities in Bennett's courtroom, carefully noting the differences in tone, language, and outcomes between white and black defendants. With a master's degree in criminal justice and a brother wrongfully imprisoned by the same system she worked within, Amara maintained a detailed record of each case, building evidence for a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. She watched as the prosecutor, Bradley Morgan, approached the bench with the comfortable familiarity of a system working in his favor. "Your Honor, while the defendant's alleged military service may be touching, the facts remain. Officer Reeves, found the defendant illegally occupying private property, displaying aggressive behavior, and resisting lawful commands. Morgan's emphasis on alleged military service and his characterization of James as aggressive were deliberate choices, coded language that played into racial stereotypes the court readily accepted. James listened silently, his expression revealing nothing of the anger and resignation competing within him. He had stood before judges, employers, loan officers, and government officials his entire adult life, watching as they found reasons to deny him the respect and opportunities freely given to his white counterparts. The courtroom, with its performances of justice and equality, was perhaps the most insulting theater of all. Throughout the hearing, Bennett addressed Morgan by his first name while referring to Lisa Chen as counsel, despite her regular appearances. In his courtroom, he interrupted her twice more as she attempted to introduce James's military commendations and his eligibility for VA housing assistance that had been repeatedly delayed through administrative errors. The pattern was so familiar, it had become almost choreography, each participant playing their assigned role in a system designed to maintain, rather than correct, inequity. As the prosecutor finished his presentation, James finally spoke, his voice, quiet but carrying the weight of dignity no circumstance had managed to strip away. "Sir, if I may address the court." Bennett looked surprised, unused to defendants speaking without prompting. "I did not resist arrest. I did not act aggressively. I am guilty only of trying to survive a freezing night when all legal shelter was denied to me." The simple truth hung in the air, temporarily disrupting the courtroom's rehearsed rhythm. Bennett's expression hardened. "Mr. Wilson, you will speak when addressed by this court. Another outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt." James nodded, once the gesture somehow conveying neither submission nor defiance, but a deep weariness, with a game whose rules were designed for his failure. The heated courtroom had grown uncomfortable, particularly for James in his layered clothing. The bailiff had already asked another defendant to remove his jacket, and now he approached James with the same instruction. James hesitated, then slowly removed his threadbare coat, carefully folding it over his arm. As he did, the movement dislodged something pinned to the inside of the jacket, a tarnished piece of metal that caught the fluorescent light. Judge Bennett's eyes were drawn to the movement, then narrowed as they focused on the object. The Bronze Star Medal, awarded for heroic achievement in combat, was pinned to the inside of James's coat rather than displayed on the outside. It was positioned where only James would know it was there, a private reminder of his worth when the world offered no such recognition. Bennett's hand, reaching for his gavel, suddenly froze. His face, usually composed into a mask of judicial severity, underwent a transformation so subtle that only those watching closely would notice. But Amara Jackson noticed everything in Bennett's courtroom, and she saw the moment recognition dawned. In the judge's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked remarkably like fear. The Bronze Star caught the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, its tarnished surface still managing to gleam with an authority that momentarily silenced even Judge Bennett. The medal, designed to recognize heroic achievement in combat, hung from a red, white, and blue ribbon, now faded with age but unmistakable in its significance. "Where did you get that medal?" Bennett's question cut through the courtroom's routine hum, his voice stripped of its judicial detachment. The abrupt change in tone caused the prosecutor to turn, confusion crossing his face. James Wilson stood straighter, the medal in his hand now, fingers tracing its edges with the familiarity of a ritual performed countless times. "I earned it. Your Honor, Kei-san, 1968. Those 4 words, spoken without emphasis, transformed the space between the two men. For Bennett, they collapsed, nearly 5 decades into a single, horrifying moment of recognition. Kei-san, 1968, the 77-day siege. The young Marine Lieutenant Raymond Bennett and the Army Specialist James Wilson, assigned to the same forward operating base during one of the Vietnam War's most brutal battles. Bennett's mind filled with unwelcome images. The red earth churned by artillery, the constant thunder of incoming fire, the stench of fear and death that no amount of subsequent success had ever fully washed away. And through the smoke of memory, a younger James Wilson moving through enemy fire to drag a wounded Marine officer to safety. "You're that Wilson?" Bennett's question emerged as barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet courtroom it carried. James looked directly at the judge now, studying his face with new attention. The years had changed Raymond Bennett considerably. The scared young lieutenant with shrapnel in his leg had become this silver-haired judge, his power and position forming an almost perfect disguise. But as recognition dawned in James's eyes, the two men shared a moment of perfect, terrible understanding. "Lieutenant Bennett," James said, the military title hanging in the air between them like an accusation. The prosecutor, Bradley Morgan, stepped forward, sensing a disruption to proceedings he couldn't quite understand. "Your Honor, if we could continue with sentencing." Bennett didn't even look at him. "The court will take a 15-minute recess." He stood abruptly, robes swirling as he retreated to his chambers with unusual haste. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs as the bailiff called for order. Lisa Chen approached her client, eyes moving between James and the door through which the judge had disappeared. "Mr. Wilson, do you know Judge Bennett?" James's laugh held no humor. "You could say that. He knows me too, though he spent a long time pretending otherwise." Across the courtroom, Amara Jackson was already typing furiously into her phone, searching for connections between a young Lieutenant Raymond Bennett and Specialist James Wilson in Vietnam, 1968. The results made her breath catch. A military commendation report, digitized and archived in a veterans database. Specialist James Wilson distinguished himself by heroic action on February 23, 1968, when he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to retrieve wounded personnel. During the siege of Khe Sanh, among those saved by Specialist Wilson's actions was Lieutenant Raymond Bennett, who had been wounded by artillery fragments while directing defensive operations. Amara's fingers hovered over her phone as the implications settled. The judge who had been prepared to sentence James Wilson to jail for seeking shelter from the cold was the same man whose life James had saved half a century earlier. What happened after that report was filed? How did the young lieutenant become a powerful judge while the man who saved him ended up homeless? Did race play a role in their diverging paths? Is institutional racism so deeply embedded in our systems that even life-saving heroism can't overcome it? If you believe racial discrimination affected how these two veterans were treated after their service, comment number 1 below. If you think their different outcomes were just a matter of personal choices, comment number 2. Hit that like button if you're as shocked as I am by this revelation, and subscribe to follow this incredible true story as it unfolds. What do you think Judge Bennett is feeling right now, locked away in his chambers confronting a past he's tried to forget? And what will happen when court reconvenes? The truth, as they say, is about to come to light. In his chambers, Raymond Bennett loosened his judicial robes with shaking hands, reaching for the bourbon he kept in his bottom desk drawer. The glass rattled against the bottle as he poured a measure far larger than his usual careful moderation would allow. The face of James Wilson, both the young soldier and the aging homeless man, blurred together in his mind. How many times had Bennett entered his own courtroom and seen James without recognizing him? Had there been previous cases, other appearances, when James had stood before him and said nothing about their shared past? Or was this their first encounter since Vietnam? Bennett couldn't be certain. The faces of defendants, particularly black defendants, had a way of blending together in the assembly line of his crowded docket. That thought brought a fresh wave of shame, quickly suppressed. Outside in the courtroom, Lisa Chen was having a hurried conversation with her client. "Mr. Wilson, this is unexpected but potentially helpful. If Judge Bennett owes you his life." James shook his head. "That man has owed me a lot of things for a long time. Never seemed to matter before." His voice carried decades of disappointment. The prosecutor approached, his confident manner slightly shaken by the unexpected turn of events. "I'm not sure what's happening here, but the state's position remains unchanged." Lisa turned to him, a new fire in her eyes. "Really, Mr. Morgan? You want to jail a decorated combat veteran who saved the judge's life for trying not to freeze to death? That's the position the state wants to take publicly?" For the first time, Morgan looked uncertain. Meanwhile, Amara had slipped out to call a journalist contact at the Atlanta Tribune. "Marcus, you need to get to Judge Bennett's courtroom right now. Something big is happening." She quickly outlined what she had discovered. This could expose a lot more than one case of ingratitude. Bennett's sentencing record shows clear racial bias, and now we have a direct connection to a black veteran he owes his life to. When court reconvened 15 minutes later, the energy in the room had transformed. Judge Bennett returned to the bench, his face composed, but his customary confidence noticeably diminished. James Wilson stood before him, the Bronze Star now, pinned to the outside of his shirt, visible to everyone. The medal seemed to grow in significance, becoming not just a recognition of one heroic act, but a symbol of promises made and broken, of two paths diverging not because of merit, but because of systemic inequalities neither man had created, but one had benefited from, while the other suffered. Bennett cleared his throat. "In light of new information, this court will need to review the circumstances of this case more thoroughly before proceeding. Mr. Wilson will be released on his own recognizance pending further review." The prosecutor began to object, then thought better of it. As the judge prepared to move to the next case, James spoke again. "Your Honor, may I ask a question?" Bennett hesitated, then nodded, the customary admonishment about speaking out of turn forgotten. "After Khe-San, after you were evacuated, did you ever wonder what happened to the men you left behind?" The question hung in the air, its surface, simplicity belying the depths beneath. Because James Wilson wasn't just asking about Vietnam, he was asking about every moment since, every door that opened for one veteran and closed for another, every assumption made, every benefit given or denied. He was asking about a system that could bring them to this moment, where one man wore robes of authority and the other stood accused of trying to survive. Is America truly the land of equal opportunity? How many veterans like James continue to struggle with homelessness and discrimination while others thrive? What do you think separated these two men's paths most? Individual choices or systemic barriers? Type justice in the comments if you believe every veteran deserves equal treatment regardless of race. Let me know if you've ever witnessed or experienced discrimination firsthand. As we continue with this incredible story, ask yourself, what would true justice look like for James Wilson after all these years? James Wilson returned from Vietnam in August 1969 with a chest full of medals, nightmares that wouldn't fade, and a country that viewed him with suspicion rather than gratitude. The airport where he landed had no cheering crowds, no welcome home banners. Instead, a white woman pulled her purse closer as he walked past in uniform, and the taxi driver who finally agreed to take him to his mother's house in Atlanta's West Side overcharged him without shame. "Welcome home, hero," James had thought, bitterly, paying the inflated fare without comment. His first visit to the Veterans Administration office established a pattern that would continue for decades. White veterans were called before him despite later arrival times. His paperwork was misplaced 3 times. When he inquired about GI Bill benefits for education, the counselor suggested trade schools rather than college, despite James's excellent service record and high aptitude scores. "Know your place," the system told him, never in those exact words, but in 1,000 small denials and redirections. Meanwhile, Raymond Bennett returned to a different America. His father, a bank executive, had connections at Emory Law School. His shrapnel wounds, much less severe than the psychological trauma haunting James, received immediate and comprehensive treatment. Bennett's Bronze Star, identical to the one James earned, opened doors when mentioned in the right company. The same medal that disappeared into bureaucratic indifference when James presented it became for Bennett a touchstone of respect and opportunity. In 1972, as James worked double shifts at a warehouse that hired him only after 3 better, paying factories rejected his applications, Bennett was finishing law school near the top of his class. When James applied for a VA home loan in 1977, the appraiser mysteriously undervalued properties in black neighborhoods, making the loans insufficient for purchase. That same year, Bennett bought his first home in a neighborhood with restrictive covenants that, while no longer legally enforceable, remained culturally observed. No black families lived on his street. The warehouse where James worked closed in 1981, moving operations to Mexico. The job market was already tight, but for black veterans it was nearly impenetrable. James took what work he could find: janitor, night watchman, day laborer, each paying less than the last. He continued visiting the VA hospital for his increasingly debilitating PTSD, only to be told repeatedly that his symptoms were not service-connected or that he was exaggerating for benefits. White veterans with identical symptoms received disability ratings and monthly compensation. In 1983, the paths of the two men briefly crossed again, though only one recognized the other. Bennett, now an assistant district attorney, was prosecuting cases in the same courthouse where he would later preside as judge. James, arrested for disturbing the peace while having a PTSD episode triggered by a backfiring car, stood before a different judge. Bennett saw his name on the docket and recognized it immediately. For a moment he considered intervening, acknowledging their connection, using his growing influence to help the man who had saved his life. Instead, he quietly left the courtroom before James's case was called, telling himself he had an important meeting. He didn't. He simply couldn't face the man he'd left behind not once but twice. By 1990, Bennett was being mentioned as a future judicial candidate, his record as a prosecutor burnished by tough stances on crime that played well with suburban voters. That same year, James was living in his car, his VA claims still pending, his appeals lost in administrative limbo. The warehouse job's pension had never vested, and his applications for housing assistance disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Once, in 1993, he actually encountered Bennett at the VA hospital. Bennett was there for a routine physical, part of his military retiree benefits that had never been questioned or delayed. James was there once again, attempting to get his PTSD claim approved. They passed in a hallway, Bennett in a tailored suit, James in worn clothes. Their eyes met briefly. Bennett looked away first, quickening his pace. James watched him go, too tired for anger. By the time Bennett received his judicial appointment in 1998, James had lost his car and was officially homeless. The America that celebrated Bennett's rise from military service to legal prominence had no room to acknowledge how it had failed James Wilson. The system's response to black veterans like James wasn't a single dramatic rejection, but a crushing accumulation of denied opportunities, delayed benefits, and diminished possibilities. In his chambers during the recess, Judge Bennett confronted these parallel histories for perhaps the first time. His success had required not just hard work, but the active suppression of uncomfortable truths about privilege and prejudice. He had never considered himself racist. He had black colleagues he respected, donated to scholarship funds for minority students, attended diversity trainings. But he had also benefited from and perpetuated a system that valued some lives and service more than others. He had sentenced black defendants more harshly while telling himself he was being tough on crime, not tough on a specific community. He had watched the statistics about racial disparities in his courtroom accumulate while dismissing them as factors beyond his control, and most damningly, he had spent decades knowing exactly who James Wilson was while allowing himself to forget. Because remembering James meant acknowledging a debt that could never be repaid, and recognizing a system of injustice that had carried Bennett to the bench while driving James to the streets. In the courtroom, Amara Jackson's research had expanded beyond the initial connection. Court records revealed that in 2011, Bennett had actually heard an appeal case involving James's VA benefits. The transcript showed Bennett recusing himself, without explanation, passing the case to another judge who ultimately denied the appeal on technical grounds. But before recusing himself, Bennett had reviewed the file, seen James's name and circumstances, and still said nothing, did nothing. Amara shared this information with Lisa Chen during the recess, the two women huddled over her phone screen. "He knew," Lisa whispered. "He's known for years." Amara nodded grimly. "And there's more. I've been tracking Bennett's sentencing for 3 years. Black defendants receive sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes in his courtroom. Black veterans specifically fare even worse. their service records often minimized or dismissed as irrelevant to current behavior in his rulings. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Word had spread among the courthouse staff, and several black bailiffs and clerks found reasons to enter the courtroom, standing along the walls with carefully neutral expressions that couldn't quite hide their interest. Judge Bennett avoided looking directly at James as he spoke. "This court will postpone further proceedings in this matter, pending a full review. Mr. Wilson will be released immediately." He was reaching for his gavel when Lisa Chen rose. "Your Honor, my client has no housing. The charges against him stem directly from his lack of shelter. What exactly is the court ordering him released to?" The question laid bare the fundamental injustice that had brought James to this point. Bennett had no answer that wouldn't further expose his complicity in a broken system. Before he could formulate a response, the courtroom doors opened, and a group of black veterans entered, some in uniform parts, others wearing caps and jackets identifying their service eras. At their head was Marcus Reynolds, the Atlanta Tribune reporter Amara had contacted, notepad already in hand. Bennett's face paled slightly at this unexpected audience. James turned to see the newcomers, his expression softening at the sight of other veterans. One man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap nodded to him with the silent recognition of shared experience. Bennett cleared his throat. "This court stands adjourned until tomorrow morning." As he rose to leave, James's voice stopped him. "You testified against me, Raymond." The use of his first name in his own courtroom visibly jolted Bennett. James continued, his voice gaining strength. "In 1987, my VA appeal, you were called as an expert witness on Vietnam combat experiences. You testified that my unit saw limited engagement and that PTSD claims from support personnel were often exaggerated. You looked me in the eye that day, and you knew who I was then too." The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. Bennett stood frozen behind the bench, judicial authority evaporating under the weight of exposed truth. "I never testified specifically about your case," he finally managed, the weakness of the defense apparent even to him. "You testified generally about men like me, knowing exactly who I was and what I'd experienced, knowing exactly what I'd done for you." James's words carried no anger, just a profound weariness with a system designed to fail him at every turn. "Tomorrow morning, Your Honor." Lisa Chen's question brought Bennett back to the immediate situation. "Yes, 10 a.m., Bennett finally managed, before retreating to his chambers with as much dignity as he could muster. Outside the courtroom, the group of veterans surrounded James, offering handshakes, contact information for veteran support groups, and most importantly, recognition. Marcus Reynolds approached with his press credentials visible. "Mr. Wilson, I'd like to hear your story if you're willing to share it." For the first time that day, James smiled slightly. After all these years, someone finally wants to hear it. That's something, I suppose. As the impromptu gathering continued, no one noticed Amara Jackson slipping into Bennett's empty courtroom, quickly downloading files from his computer system. The records she accessed would reveal not just Bennett's history with James, but a pattern of judicial decisions that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. The truth, buried for decades beneath layers of privilege and power, was finally rising to the surface, carried upward by currents of long-denied justice. By the following morning, James Wilson's face appeared on the front page of the Atlanta Tribune under the headline, "Judge presides over case of homeless veteran who saved his life." Marcus Reynolds' article detailed their Vietnam connection, the Bronze Star both men received, and the drastically different treatment they'd experienced in the 50 years since. The story included statistics on black veterans' benefits denial rates, homelessness, and the racial sentencing disparities. In Judge Bennett's courtroom, it stopped short of directly alleging racial bias, letting the numbers and parallel life trajectories speak for themselves. Amara Jackson had provided Marcus with access to her meticulous records of Bennett's sentencing patterns, anonymized but unmistakable in their consistency. The courthouse plaza buzzed with reporters by 9:30 a.m., satellite trucks lining the street as the story gained national traction. Inside, the hallway outside courtroom 3B overflowed with spectators, including dozens of black veterans in Military caps and jackets. They came from across Georgia, alerted through veteran networks that had mobilized overnight. Their presence transformed the proceedings from a single case into something larger, a symbolic reckoning with how America treated those who served while black. Lisa Chen arrived early, accompanied by Walter Prentice, a prominent civil rights attorney who had offered his services pro bono after seeing the morning news. James entered with them, wearing a clean button-down shirt provided by a veterans organization, the Bronze Star prominently displayed. The night before, he'd stayed at the home of Tyrone Washington, a Vietnam veteran who'd recognized him from the evening news coverage. "Brothers take care of brothers," Tyrone had said simply, showing James to a spare bedroom, the first real bed he'd slept in for months. The courthouse security checkpoint moved white attendees through quickly, while subjecting black visitors to additional scrutiny, a disparity so routine it usually went unremarked. Today, with dozens of witnesses and media attention, the different treatment became part of the unfolding story. Several reporters filmed the process, capturing what veterans like James had experienced their entire lives. Judge Bennett's clerk approached Lisa and Walter before proceedings began. Judge Bennett would like to move this case to his private chambers, given the unusual circumstances. Walter Prentice shook his head firmly. "The circumstances aren't unusual, Counselor. They're just finally visible. We'll proceed in open court as scheduled." The clerk retreated, visibly uncomfortable. Minutes later, Bradley Morgan, the prosecutor, approached with a similar suggestion. "This media circus isn't helping anyone. We're prepared to dismiss all charges if Mr. Wilson agrees to a quiet resolution." Lisa's response was immediate. "Mr. Wilson has been quiet for 50 years. That's rather the problem, isn't it?" When Judge Bennett entered the courtroom at exactly 10 a.m., his usual commanding presence had diminished noticeably. His eyes swept over the packed gallery, lingering momentarily on the veterans before settling on James. For the first time, he truly looked at the man standing before him, allowing himself to see not just the homeless defendant, but the soldier who had dragged him to safety through artillery fire. "Before we proceed," Bennett began, his voice less certain than usual, "I want to acknowledge that I should have recused myself from this case immediately upon recognizing Mr. Wilson. My failure to do so was an oversight." The understatement hung in the air, its inadequacy apparent to everyone present. Walter Prentice rose. "Your Honor, oversight seems insufficient to describe presiding over the case of a man who saved your life, whose VA benefits you testified against, and whose housing application you personally rejected in 1997 while serving on the VA Regional Review Board." This new revelation caused murmurs throughout the courtroom. Bennett's face registered shock. "I never rejected any specific application. You chaired the committee that created the policy automatically denying applications from veterans with certain discharge classifications, a policy later found to disproportionately impact black veterans. Mr. Wilson's application was among the first rejected under that policy." Prentice's command of the facts left Bennett momentarily speechless. The judge's colleagues had begun to arrive, several other judges from the courthouse slipping into back row seats. Their expressions concerned less with justice than with institutional damage control. James watched them enter, recognizing the familiar circling of wagons he'd witnessed throughout his life whenever systems of power faced exposure. "Your Honor," James finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension, "I recognized you the moment I walked into this courtroom yesterday, just like I recognized you at the VA hospital in '93, and at the benefits hearing in '87, and when you were an ADA in '83. Each time you saw me too. Each time you walked away." The simple truth of this statement silenced the room. Bennett's hands gripped the edge of the bench. "Mr. Wilson, In Khe Sanh," James continued, "you called me a hero. You promised you'd never forget what I did. Then you spent 50 years forgetting or pretending to. Which was it, Raymond?" The use of the judge's first name again in this formal setting emphasized how profoundly the power dynamic had shifted. Before Bennett could answer, the courtroom doors opened and 3 more figures entered. Senator William Marshall, a prominent conservative who had championed Bennett's judicial appointment, Chief Judge Caroline Rivera, who oversaw the district, and District Attorney Howard Phillips. Their presence signaled that the implications of this case had escalated beyond a simple trespassing charge. Marcus Reynolds scribbled furiously in his notepad as the political heavyweights took seats directly behind the prosecutor. Chief Judge Rivera passed a note to Bennett's clerk, who delivered it to the bench. After reading it, Bennett cleared his throat. "This court will take a 30-minute recess." As he rose, James called after him, "Running away again, Lieutenant?" The words stopped Bennett mid-stride. For a moment, the courtroom glimpsed not the distinguished judge, but the terrified young officer, bleeding in the red dirt of Vietnam, as enemy fire rained around him. Then Bennett disappeared through the door to his chambers, followed quickly by Rivera, Marshall, and Phillips. In the gallery, an elderly black veteran named Joseph Carpenter rose shakily to his feet. "I served with Wilson in Nam, the lieutenant here." He gestured toward the door Bennett had exited through. "He used to call us jungle bunnies when no officers were around. After Wilson saved him, suddenly we were all brothers in arms." Funny how a little brush with death changed his tune, at least for a while. The revelation spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Reporters typing frantically on phones and laptops. During the recess, the hallway became an impromptu forum as more veterans shared stories of service, followed by systemic neglect. Inside, the judge's chambers, a heated discussion unfolded. "You need to recuse yourself immediately," Chief Judge Rivera insisted. "This is becoming a media nightmare." Senator Marshall's concern was more political. "The racial angle is problematic. We need to contain this before it undermines public confidence in the judiciary." District Attorney Phillips was bluntest. "Did you really use racial slurs during your service, Raymond? Because if that gets confirmed by multiple sources, we've got a much bigger problem than one homeless veteran." Bennett sat behind his desk, the carefully constructed facade of his life crumbling around him. "It was a different time," he began weakly. "We all said things." The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Rivera cut him off. "I'm reassigning this case effective immediately. Judge Watkins will take over. We'll cite conflict of interest, nothing more." Marshall nodded approval. "And we'll have the DA's office dismiss all charges. Get this Wilson character some token assistance and put this whole mess behind us." Bennett looked up. "James Wilson isn't a character. He's a decorated combat veteran who saved my life and at least 7 others during the Khe Sanh siege. He's a man I've failed repeatedly for 5 decades. The admission surprised everyone, including Bennett himself. When court reconvened, Chief Judge Rivera took the bench instead of Bennett, announcing the case reassignment and immediate dismissal of all charges. But as the prosecutor moved to formalize the dismissal, James Wilson rose. "I'd like to address the court." Rivera hesitated, then nodded. "These charges exist because I had nowhere to go in freezing weather. Dismissing them changes nothing about the systemic failures that put me on the street. It changes nothing about how black veterans have been treated since we came home. And it changes nothing about how Judge Bennett and others like him have perpetuated these injustices from positions of power." His words resonated through the packed courtroom. "I don't want charges dismissed. I want accountability. I want acknowledgement. And I want change." The simplicity and moral clarity of his demand hung in the air as cameras flashed and reporters captured every word. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to hundreds, the story touching a nerve in a city with deep civil rights roots. Inside, Judge Rivera struggled to maintain control of a proceeding that had transcended ordinary judicial boundaries. "Mr. Wilson, while the court appreciates your position, the dismissal of charges is not contingent on your acceptance." Walter Prentice stood. "Your Honor, my client is declining dismissal and requesting a full hearing on the merits, with Judge Bennett testifying under oath about their shared history." The unprecedented request sent shockwaves through the legal professionals present. "Counsel, that's not how our system works," Rivera responded, her composure slipping. From the gallery a voice called out, "Maybe that's exactly the problem." The speaker, an elderly black woman, continued, "My husband died waiting for VA benefits. Judge Bennett's committee denied. This isn't about one case or one night in the cold, it's about a lifetime of injustice. As murmurs of agreement spread, Rivera banged her gavel for order. This court is adjourned until further notice. The charges against Mr. Wilson are dismissed regardless of his objection. As she hurried from the bench, the formal conclusion did nothing to resolve the moral questions now fully exposed to public view. Outside the courtroom, James found himself surrounded by supporters, journalists, and veterans with similar stories. For perhaps the first time since his return from Vietnam, his experience was being acknowledged, his voice amplified rather than silenced. Meanwhile, in a private conference room, Bennett sat alone, finally facing the truth of who he was and what he had done. The carefully constructed narrative of his life and career lay in ruins around him, revealed not as the story of merit rewarded, but of privilege protected at the expense of those who deserved better. His Bronze Star, displayed prominently in his office for decades, no longer seemed like a symbol of honor but of hypocrisy. What would happen next in this extraordinary confrontation between two veterans whose lives had diverged so dramatically after serving the same country? Would Judge Bennett finally acknowledge his role in perpetuating racial injustice? Would James Wilson receive the recognition and support he'd been denied for decades? And what about the thousands of other black veterans who'd faced similar discrimination? This story is rapidly evolving, but one thing is clear. The medals both men earned in Vietnam now symbolize not just military courage, but the courage to finally face uncomfortable truths about race in America. The judicial system's response to James Wilson's stand was swift and multi-layered, a bureaucratic fortress protecting itself from exposure. By that afternoon, Chief Judge Caroline Rivera had issued an administrative order removing James's case from the public docket, citing procedural irregularities. Court transcripts from the two hearings were sealed pending review, officially to protect the privacy of all parties, but effectively suppressing the public record of what had transpired. The courthouse public information officer issued a terse statement. A routine case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Reports of other factors influencing the proceedings are speculative and unsubstantiated. This sanitized version collided with reality outside the courthouse, where dozens of news cameras captured the continuing protest. Black veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, many wearing their service medals, holding signs reading, "Justice for James Wilson and Black Veterans Matter." The story had transcended local news, with national outlets picking it up as emblematic of broader issues facing minority veterans. Senator William Marshall moved from damage control to counterattack, appearing on a conservative news program that evening. This is a regrettable situation being exploited by activists with an agenda. Judge Bennett's distinguished career shouldn't be defined by interactions with one individual from decades ago. The show's host didn't challenge this framing, instead steering the conversation toward the danger of applying today's standards to past behaviors. Meanwhile, inside the power structures of Atlanta, more consequential maneuvers unfolded. The police department's Internal Affairs Division quietly launched an investigation into James's arresting officers, not for their treatment of James, but for failure to properly document the encounter, a bureaucratic sidestep that addressed paperwork rather than prejudice. The Veterans Affairs Regional Office suddenly discovered James's long-missing benefits. Paperwork, fast-tracking his claims after decades of delays. Administrative oversight was the official explanation, as though his file had simply been misplaced for 50 years rather than systematically deprioritized. These reactive measures formed a familiar pattern to those who had long observed institutional responses to exposed injustice. Minimize, compartmentalize, individualize, and ultimately preserve the system while sacrificing as few components as possible. Most concerning was the pressure applied to James himself. The morning after the dramatic courtroom confrontation, two representatives from the mayor's office visited him at Tyrone Washington's home, where he was still staying. They brought an offer: immediate placement in veterans' housing, backdated benefits, and a modest settlement in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement and public statement that his case had been resolved satisfactorily. "The city wants to make this right," one representative explained, not meeting James's eyes. This offer expires at 5 p.m. today. The pressure tactic was transparent but effective for many in James's position, the immediate relief of tangible assistance outweighing the principle at stake. James listened to the offer without expression. "I spent 50 years being silenced," he finally responded. "I'm not spending whatever years I have left the same way." Walter Prentice, now formally representing James in all matters, reinforced his client's position. Mr. Wilson's case is not an isolated incident to be quietly resolved. It represents systemic issues affecting thousands of veterans. Any resolution must acknowledge and address these broader concerns. The representatives departed empty-handed, their expressions suggesting this response was not unexpected. They had come prepared to fail, the offer itself more about creating a record of attempted resolution than actually achieving one. By that afternoon, James was scheduled to appear on several national news programs, his story expanding beyond Judge Bennett to encompass the larger issue of how America treated its black veterans. This broader framing threatened multiple institutions, from the VA to the criminal justice system to the military itself. Powerful interests began coordinating their response, a process James and his growing support network could track through. Increasingly hostile media coverage and political statements. The Atlanta Police Union issued a statement defending the arresting officers and characterizing James as combative during a lawful arrest, directly contradicting the body cam footage that Lisa Chen had finally obtained. The union president suggested that James was being used by activists with an agenda, echoing Senator Marshall's language with striking similarity. Social media accounts with few followers but identical talking points suddenly appeared, questioning James's military record, suggesting his homelessness was a choice or result of personal failings, and defending Judge Bennett as tough but fair. The coordinated nature of these attacks was obvious to media observers, but still influenced public perception among those predisposed to believe such narratives. The veterans supporting James weren't surprised by these tactics. "Same playbook they've been using since we came home," Tyrone Washington commented, as they watched the coverage together. "First they ignore you, then they discredit you, then they try to buy you off. When that fails, they attack your character." James nodded, the pattern familiar from decades of fighting for his rightful benefits. "And if all else fails, they wait you out, hoping you'll die before they have to make good." The cynical observation carried the weight of too many comrades lost during years-long appeals processes. Despite these systemic resistance efforts, James's story continued gaining traction, resonating with broader conversations about racial justice. Walter Prentice, recognizing the moment's potential, filed a class-action lawsuit on behalf of James and similarly situated black veterans, alleging systematic discrimination in benefits administration, housing access, and treatment within the criminal justice system. The legal action shifted the frame from an individual case that could be quietly resolved to a structural challenge requiring institutional response. Judge Bennett, meanwhile, had taken medical leave, citing exhaustion. His colleagues closed ranks around him publicly while privately distancing themselves, the judicial equivalent of quarantine. The court's administrative machinery continued functioning without him, processing cases with the same biases and presumptions that had defined his courtroom, just without the suddenly problematic face attached. On the lawsuit's third day, as James prepared for another round of interviews, he experienced a severe PTSD episode triggered by a backfiring car near Tyrone's home. The flashback to combat sent him into a defensive posture on the front lawn, disoriented and shouting warnings to comrades 50 years dead. Neighbors, seeing only a black man acting erratically, called police. The responding officers, unaware of James's identity or circumstances, approached with weapons drawn, shouting commands that James in his triggered state couldn't process. The confrontation would likely have ended tragically, but for Tyrone's intervention. Standing between James and the officers, Tyrone used his own veteran status to de-escalate, explaining the situation while news cameras that had been stationed outside the house recorded the entire incident. The footage, showing a decorated combat veteran nearly shot for experiencing the after-effects of his service, went viral immediately. It transformed James from a sympathetic figure in a local controversy to a national symbol of how America failed its black veterans. The near tragedy crystallized the stakes of his fight in ways abstract discussions of benefits and housing never could. Would the system finally acknowledge the truth about how it treated black veterans? Could James's case become the catalyst for meaningful change after decades of institutional resistance? Why did it take such extreme circumstances for America to see the injustice that had been hiding in plain sight? If you believe systemic racism continues to impact veterans like James Wilson, comment number 1 below. If you think America treats all its veterans equally regardless of race, comment number 2. Like this video if you agree that no veteran should end up homeless after serving their country, and subscribe to follow James's continuing fight for justice. What do you think it would take for institutions to truly change how they treat minority veterans? And what responsibility do people like Judge Bennett bear for maintaining systems that discriminate even when they don't consider themselves racist? As we continue following this powerful story, remember that for every James Wilson whose story makes headlines, thousands more face similar struggles in silence. That evening, as the footage of James's PTSD episode dominated news cycles, the VA secretary issued an emergency directive ordering a review of all denied benefit claims from black veterans during the period when Judge Bennett served on the Regional Review Board. The directive specifically cited potential procedural irregularities rather than racial bias, but the implication was clear. The system was finally responding, not out of moral awakening but from fear of exposure. For James, watching the announcement from Tyrone's living room, the moment carried a bittersweet quality. Took them 50 years and a national scandal to do what should have been automatic, he observed quietly. How many brothers didn't live to see even this much acknowledgement? The question hung in the air, unanswerable, but essential to understanding. The true cost of America's long failure to honor its promises to those who served while black. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries, away from cameras and reporters. James Wilson and Raymond Bennett would face each other privately in the law offices of Walter Prentice, neutral ground where neither man held institutional advantage. Bennett arrived first, driven by his wife in an unmarked car to avoid the media still camped outside his suburban home. Gone were his judicial robes and the confident bearing that had defined his public persona for decades. In their place was an aging man in a simple suit, moving with the slight hesitation of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. James arrived 15 minutes later, accompanied by Tyrone Washington and Lisa Chen. The support team reflected not just legal strategy, but the reality that James had never been allowed the luxury of facing systems of power alone. Individual. Confrontations with institutions had always ended badly for him. Solidarity had become necessary survival. Walter Prentice led them to a conference room where Bennett waited, the large table between them, a physical manifestation of the distance 50 years had created. Judge Bennett has requested this meeting without preconditions, Prentice explained, his tone professional but cool. My client has agreed to hear what he has to say. Bennett nodded, his eyes fixed on James. The Bronze Star was again pinned to James's shirt, impossible to ignore. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Mr. Wilson. The formality sounded strange. After their courtroom confrontation, a retreat to safer, more familiar ground. James simply nodded, waiting. Bennett had called this meeting. The burden of beginning rested with him. I owe you an apology, Bennett started, the words coming with visible difficulty. Not just for failing to recuse myself from your case, but for much more than that. James's expression remained unchanged, decades of disappointment having taught him to measure actions rather than words. Bennett continued, his carefully prepared statement abandoning him under James's steady gaze. In Vietnam, after you pulled me out of that artillery fire, I made promises about remembering, about having your back when we got home. I meant them in that moment, I truly did. But meaning something in a moment of fear isn't the same as living by it when the fear passes, James observed, his voice level. Bennett nodded, a flush spreading across his face. When we returned home, things were complicated. Were they? James asked. Seems simple enough to me. You went one way, I went another. The difference was never about qualifications or character. It was about who the system was designed to serve and who it was designed to control. The blunt assessment hung in the air between them. Bennett started to offer a defense, then stopped himself. I didn't see it that way then. I told myself my opportunities came from hard work, good decisions. While my struggles must have come from poor choices, James suggested. That's a comforting narrative when you're on the winning side of it. Bennett's discomfort was visible, but to his credit, he didn't retreat from the conversation. There's something you should know. In 1986, when I worked briefly at the VA regional office, your benefits appeal crossed my desk. James leaned forward slightly, this new information capturing his full attention. I recognized your name immediately, Bennett continued. I reviewed your case file, saw the PTSD diagnosis from the VA doctor, the documentation of your combat experience, your Purple Heart and Bronze Star. All of it supported your claim. Yet my appeal was denied, James said, stamped with your signature. Bennett nodded, unable to meet James's eyes. I told myself I was following policy guidelines, applying the same standards to everyone. But I knew your case was valid. I knew what you'd experienced because I'd been there, and I still denied it. The admission was more than James had expected, a confirmation of what he'd long suspected, but could never prove. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know it wasn't you, wasn't anything you did wrong. The system was. I was. Bennett struggled to complete the thought. I was protecting my own position in a hierarchy that benefited me. The rare moment of genuine self-reflection from someone in Bennett's position might have been satisfying under different circumstances. But acknowledgement, while necessary, couldn't restore what had been taken from James. Decades of dignity, opportunity, and peace. I lost my apartment after that denial, James said quietly. Started living in my car. Lost my job when I couldn't maintain a permanent address. Couldn't get my medication regularly without benefits. Spiraled for years before finding temporary stability, only to lose it again when the economy crashed in 2008. All those dominoes started falling with that denial letter you signed. Bennett winced at the concrete consequences of his abstract policy decision. The committees I served on, the sentencing guidelines I endorsed as a judge, the housing policies I supported on civic boards, I never saw them as weapons. I saw them as maintaining order, standards. The comfort of distance, James observed. You never had to see what happened to the people on the receiving end of those policies. I didn't have that luxury. None of us did. The us encompassed not just James, but generations of black veterans who had served a country that systematically failed to honor its promises to them. Lisa Chen, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Judge Bennett, your acknowledgement of personal responsibility is noted, but this meeting needs to address more than individual actions. What are you prepared to do about the systemic issues your career has reinforced? The question shifted the conversation from confession to consequence, from past to future. Bennett seemed momentarily taken aback by the transition. I've submitted my resignation from the bench, effective immediately. That protects you from investigation, but does nothing for the people harmed by your decisions, Tyrone pointed out. Thousands of cases with demonstrable racial bias in sentencing, benefit denials, housing rejections. Bennett nodded slowly. I understand. I'm prepared to provide sworn testimony about the policies and practices I participated in, including the unwritten rules and assumptions that guided decision-making. The offer represented a significant breach of the systems that had protected Bennett and others like him throughout their careers. The code of silence around institutional bias was powerful precisely because it was rarely broken, particularly by those who had benefited most from it. That testimony could be crucial for our class action lawsuit, Walter Prentice noted, making no attempt to hide his surprise at Bennett's willingness to cross this line. It would provide internal confirmation of what the statistics already show. James studied Bennett's face, searching for the motivation behind this unexpected cooperation. Why now? You've had 50 years to speak up. Bennett's answer came after a long pause. Because I'm ashamed, not just of what I did or failed to do, but of how easily I accepted benefits I denied to others, how comfortable I became with inequality, as long as it advantaged me. He removed a small object from his pocket, placing it on the table between them, his own bronze star, polished and mounted in a display case. We earned these for the same reasons, on the same battlefield. Mine opened doors. Yours became something you had to hide inside your coat, a private reminder of worth when the world offered no such recognition. The parallel crystallized their divergent experiences in a way abstract discussions of systemic racism often failed to capture. I can't undo what happened to you, James, but I can help ensure the truth is finally acknowledged. James reached slowly across the table, not for Bennett's medal but for his own, unpinning it from his shirt. He placed it beside Bennett's, the two decorations side by side after 50 years of separation. These were never just about what happened in Vietnam, James said quietly. They were supposed to be promises about what would happen after, promises kept for you, broken for me. Bennett nodded, the simple truth of this statement beyond dispute. The lawsuit will seek systemic changes, not just compensation, Walter explained. Reform of VA benefits administration, sentencing guideline revisions, new oversight for housing program implementation, and a formal review of cases handled by judges with demonstrated bias patterns. I'll testify to whatever is needed, Bennett affirmed, and I've secured agreement from 3 other retired judges to do the same. This unexpected development suggested Bennett had been working behind the scenes, perhaps finding others similarly motivated by conscience, or at least by the desire to be on the right side of a rapidly shifting narrative. As the meeting concluded, James and Bennett stood facing each other, no table between them now. "In Khe-Sanh, you called me brother," James said, his voice carrying 5 decades of accumulated pain and resilience. "I'm not looking for brotherhood from you now, Raymond. I'm looking for justice, not just for me, but for every black veteran who came home to find the country they served didn't serve them back." Bennett extended his hand, a gesture that acknowledged James's dignity, rather than seeking absolution. For himself, "You'll have my full cooperation, Mr. Wilson. It's 50 years overdue." James accepted the handshake briefly, his expression suggesting that while this meeting represented progress, the distance between acknowledgement and actual justice remained vast. As they prepared to leave, Bennett asked one final question. "All these years, through everything the system put you through, you kept that medal. Why?" James considered the question, his hand resting momentarily on the bronze star still lying on the conference table. "Not for what America did for me, but for what I did despite America. Every time someone looked through me like I was invisible, every time a door closed because of my skin, every night spent in my car or on the street, that medal reminded me that I had value no system could take away." The answer contained no absolution for Bennett or the country he represented, only the hard-won wisdom of a man who had been forced to find dignity within himself when his nation refused to recognize it. As James departed with his support team, he left his bronze star on the table, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes. He no longer needed a private reminder of his worth. The public reckoning that was now unfolding would serve that purpose far more effectively than any medal ever could. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta buzzed with anticipation as the class action hearing prepared to commence. In the 6 weeks since James Wilson's encounter with Judge Bennett, his individual case had transformed into a sweeping challenge to systemic discrimination against black veterans. The cavernous ceremonial courtroom, reserved for cases of extraordinary public interest, filled to capacity an hour before proceedings began. Black veterans from across the country occupied the front rows, many wearing caps or jackets identifying their eras of service, from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Behind them sat representatives from veteran service organizations, civil rights groups, and government agencies, including a visibly uncomfortable delegation from the Department of Veterans Affairs. News cameras clustered outside, prohibited from the courtroom itself, but capturing the historic gathering of those whose service had been honored in word, but not in deed. James Wilson entered alongside Walter Prentice and a legal team that had expanded to include attorneys specializing in veterans law, civil rights, and institutional reform. No longer homeless, James now resided in a veterans' supportive housing, complex established in response to the publicity surrounding his case. The rapid provision of services that had eluded him for decades illustrated precisely the arbitrary nature of the system he was challenging, how resources appeared when political pressure demanded it, rather than when veterans needed them. Judge Melissa Thornton, an Obama appointee with a reputation for meticulous attention to evidence, would preside over the hearing. Her selection had been deliberate. The judicial assignment system bypassed to ensure the case received a fair evaluation, without the institutional biases that had characterized Judge Bennett's court. The proceedings began with Walter Prentice's opening statement, framing the case not as an indictment of individuals, but of systems designed to produce unequal outcomes while maintaining a facade of neutrality. This case will demonstrate through statistical evidence, internal documents, and testimony from within the system itself that black veterans have been systematically denied equal access to benefits, housing, health care, and justice, Prentice began. The discrimination they faced was rarely explicit in policy language, but was devastatingly consistent in implementation and outcome. The defense table contained representatives from multiple government entities: the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Justice, and the state of Georgia. Their fractured defense strategy was apparent from the outset, each agency attempting to distance itself from responsibility while acknowledging the troubling patterns the lawsuit identified. The federal government recognizes the historic challenges faced by minority veterans, began the Justice Department attorney, choosing words carefully crafted to acknowledge injustice without admitting liability. However, the plaintiff's allegations of deliberate discrimination overstate what were often complex administrative challenges affecting many veterans regardless of race. This attempt to dilute the racial component of veteran discrimination was immediately countered by the plaintiff's first expert witness, Dr. Elaine Michaels, a statistician who had analyzed 50 years of VA claims data. After controlling for all relevant variables including disability type, service era, rank, and claim completeness, black veterans were 42% less likely to have their benefits approved on initial application, waited an average of 17 months longer for decisions, and received disability ratings averaging 23% lower than white veterans with identical conditions. The numbers painted a devastating picture of disparate treatment, too consistent to be explained by chance or neutral factors. Similar patterns emerged across housing assistance, GI Bill implementation, healthcare access, and criminal justice outcomes. Throughout the morning, the defense attorneys tried to frame these disparities as unfortunate administrative failures rather than evidence of systemic racism. This narrative collapsed entirely when Raymond Bennett took the stand after lunch. His appearance caused a stir throughout the courtroom, the former judge now testifying against the very systems he had long served. Bennett had visibly aged in the weeks since his confrontation with James, the stress of his public fall and private reckoning etched into his face. After being sworn in, he spoke clearly into the microphone. "I served on the VA Regional Appeals Board from 1985 to 1987, followed by 22 years as a criminal court judge. In both capacities, I participated in and perpetuated systematic discrimination against black veterans." The blunt admission silenced the courtroom. The federal attorneys exchanged alarmed glances, their carefully constructed defense strategy evaporating with each word from a witness whose insider status made his testimony particularly damaging. "Was this discrimination explicitly directed by policy?" Walter Prentice asked. Bennett shook his head. "Rarely. It operated through what we called discretionary factors and credibility assessments. When reviewing PTSD claims, for example, we were trained to evaluate whether symptoms aligned with typical presentation, but our understanding of typical was based almost exclusively on studies of white veterans." He continued, describing how claims from black veterans were subjected to higher scrutiny, their military records questioned more frequently, their medical symptoms more often attributed to pre-service or post-service factors rather than their time in uniform. We created additional administrative hurdles without explicitly acknowledging their disproportionate impact. When a white veteran's paperwork had minor errors, We often provided assistance in correcting them. When black veterans had similar issues, we issued technical denials requiring them to restart the entire process. The pattern Bennett described repeated across housing applications, educational benefit approvals, and eventually his judicial decisions. As a judge, I sentenced black defendants, including veterans, to terms averaging 47% longer than white defendants for equivalent crimes. I justified this through subjective assessments of remorse, rehabilitation potential, and community ties, all criteria that subtly encoded racial bias into seemingly neutral decisions. Most damning was Bennett's description of conversations among colleagues behind closed doors. We knew the disparities existed. They were sometimes even joked about in chambers, but we framed them as reflecting real differences in the populations rather than bias in our evaluations. As Bennett's testimony continued, James watched from the plaintiff's table, his expression revealing little of the complex emotions this public confession must have generated. The man whose life had diverged so dramatically from his own after Vietnam was now providing the evidence that might finally force a reckoning with the systems that had created that divergence. The defense attorneys had limited options for cross-examination, as challenging Bennett's insider knowledge would only emphasize his authority on the subject. Instead, they attempted to portray his testimony as motivated by personal guilt over his treatment of James specifically, rather than reflecting broader systemic patterns. Isn't it true that your current statements are influenced by your personal relationship with lead plaintiff James Wilson? The VA attorney asked. Bennett's response was measured. My recognition of these systemic issues began with my failure. Toward James Wilson, yes, but what I'm describing today affected thousands of veterans across decades. My personal connection to one case simply removed the shield of denial I had constructed. Following Bennett's testimony, 3 additional former officials provided similar insider accounts, their combined evidence forming an unprecedented acknowledgement of how systems ostensibly designed to serve all veterans had in practice discriminated against those who were black. The hearing's most powerful moment came when James himself took the stand late in the afternoon. At 67, his bearing still reflected his military training, his voice steady as he recounted not just his personal experience, but how it represented a collective injury to black veterans as a group. I'm not here just for my denied benefits or my years of homelessness, he explained. I'm here because my story is not unique. It's not even unusual. Nearly every black veteran I've known has faced some version of the same struggle, fighting our country's enemies abroad only to return and fight our country's biases at home. He described the cumulative impact of repeated denials, delays, and dismissals, how they eroded not just financial stability, but fundamental dignity. Each rejection carried the same message. Your service matters less. Your suffering counts less. Your citizenship means less because of your race. Throughout his testimony, James maintained the composure that had carried him through decades of institutional resistance, but the emotional impact on the courtroom was profound. Several veterans in the audience wiped away tears as he spoke, his individual story giving voice to collective experiences long suppressed or dismissed. The medals they gave us were supposed to mean something, James concluded. Not just about what we did in combat, but about how our country would treat us afterward. For white veterans, that promise was generally kept. For us, it became another broken contract in a long history of them. As the first day of hearings concluded, Judge Thornton made an unusual statement from the bench. This court recognizes the extraordinary nature of today's testimony and its implications not just for this case, but for our understanding of how neutral-appearing systems can produce deeply unequal outcomes. We will continue tomorrow with additional witnesses and begin examining the remedies phase of these proceedings. Outside the courthouse, as evening fell, James found himself at the center of an impromptu gathering of veterans who had attended the hearing. They formed a circle around him, each waiting to shake his hand or share brief words of gratitude for giving public voice to experiences many had endured in private resignation. Among them was Joseph Carpenter, the veteran who had served with James and Bennett in Vietnam. Never thought I'd live to see this day, the elderly man said, his voice thick with emotion, them finally having to hear us. James embraced him, the simple acknowledgement between them carrying half a century of shared understanding. As the gathering dispersed, reporters approached James for comment on the day's proceedings. Instead of the soundbite they sought, he offered a reflection that captured both the significance and the limitations of what was unfolding. "Today was about truth-telling," he said. "Tomorrow needs to be about change-making. Recognition without repair is just another form of disappointment." The quote would appear in headlines across the country the following morning, as the nation confronted not just the specific discrimination against black veterans, but the broader patterns their treatment exemplified. The systems that had failed James Wilson and countless others like him now faced unprecedented exposure, their mechanisms of bias laid bare not by outside accusation, but by insider confession. Whether this exposure would translate into meaningful reform remained to be seen, but the public silence that had long protected these systems from accountability had been irrevocably broken. 1 year after James Wilson stood in Judge Bennett's courtroom, facing trespassing charges, he stood before a different audience in a different Washington venue. The congressional hearing room buzzed with anticipation as the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee prepared to hear testimony on the Veteran Equity and Justice Act, legislation directly inspired by the class action lawsuit that had begun with James's case. Behind him sat rows of black veterans representing every conflict from Vietnam to Afghanistan, their presence ensuring this hearing would not become another exercise in political theater without substantive result. Senator Elaine Roberts, the committee chair, called the session to order. Today we consider legislation addressing long-standing disparities in how our nation has treated veterans of color. These disparities, documented extensively in both the Wilson v. Department of Veterans Affairs settlement and subsequent government reviews, represent a failure to honor the promise America makes to all who serve under its flag. James adjusted the microphone as he prepared to deliver his opening statement. At 68, he carried himself with the dignity that had sustained him through decades of systemic resistance, now channeled into advocacy rather than mere survival. The bronze star that once remained hidden inside his coat now gleamed on. His lapel, a public symbol of service too long unrecognized. "I come before you not just as an individual who experienced homelessness despite honorable service," James began, "but as a representative of generations of black veterans who returned home to find the country they defended did not defend their rights in return. The legislation before you today cannot undo decades of discrimination, but it can ensure those still living receive the benefits they earned and establish systems to prevent similar injustices for future generations." The journey from that Atlanta courtroom to this moment of potential transformation had been neither simple nor assured. The class action lawsuit had resulted in a historic settlement 6 months earlier, with the federal government acknowledging significant disparities in benefit administration, housing access, and treatment within the justice system affecting black veterans. The acknowledgement, while carefully worded to limit liability, represented an unprecedented admission of systemic racial bias in veteran services. The settlement established a streamlined claims process for black veterans whose benefits had been denied, created new oversight mechanisms for VA operations, required regular equity audits of housing programs, and established sentencing guidelines, reforms specifically addressing disparities affecting veterans of color. Most significantly, it mandated the creation of the legislation James now testified to support, converting temporary remedies into permanent protections. Raymond Bennett sat in the audience, no longer a judge, but now a consultant to the Senate committee, his insider knowledge of how systems encode bias informing the legislation's design. His fall from the bench had been followed by an unexpected transformation, his remaining years now dedicated to dismantling the very structures of inequality he had once upheld. Their paths, so drastically divergent for 5 decades, had not exactly converged, but now at least ran parallel toward a common objective. The Atlanta courthouse where their confrontation began had itself undergone significant changes. Judge Melissa Thornton, who presided over the class action hearing, now led a judicial review committee examining racial disparities in sentencing across the federal court system. Amara Jackson's meticulous documentation of Bennett's courtroom patterns had become a template for similar analyses nationwide, revealing that what happened in Atlanta was not exceptional, but representative. Lisa Chen had been appointed to a federal task force on public defense reform, her experience with James's case illustrating how legal representation for indigent defendants, particularly veterans, required fundamental restructuring rather than incremental improvement. Beyond individual changes, institutional practices had begun shifting in response to the scrutiny James's case generated. The Veterans Affairs Claims System implemented blind review protocols to reduce bias in benefit determinations. Housing assistance programs revised eligibility criteria that had disproportionately excluded minority applicants. Police departments across the country adopted new training for interacting with veterans experiencing PTSD, with James's near-tragic encounter becoming a case study in what not to do. The most personal transformation, however, had occurred in James's own life. The settlement had provided him not just with the long-denied benefits and housing he deserved, but with a platform to advocate for others. The James Wilson Veterans Justice Center now occupied a formerly abandoned building in Atlanta's West Side, offering housing assistance, benefit application support, and legal services to veterans facing challenges similar to those James had endured. Funded partially through the settlement and partially through donations that poured in as his story spread, the center embodied the principle that recognition without repair was insufficient. As James continued his testimony, he emphasized that the proposed legislation represented not charity, but obligation. This act simply ensures that promises already made are finally kept. The debt owed is not new, only the commitment to pay it is. The senators listened with varying degrees of engagement, some clearly moved by James's dignified presentation, others more concerned with political calculations. When the questioning began, Senator Harold Williams, a conservative who had initially opposed the legislation, addressed James directly. "While I respect your service, Mr. Wilson, don't you worry that establishing special provisions for specific groups undermines the universal nature of veteran benefits?" The question represented the familiar resistance to acknowledging that universal systems often produce unequal outcomes. James's response was measured but firm. "Senator, when a system consistently delivers different results based on race despite identical service and identical needs, the system itself has already created special provisions through its implementation. This legislation simply corrects that imbalance rather than creating it." The answer silenced Williams momentarily, its logic difficult to dispute without revealing underlying biases. As the hearing continued, James observed Raymond Bennett watching from the audience, their eyes meeting briefly across the crowded room. The complex emotions that passed between them in that glance encompassed their shared past, divergent journeys, and current unlikely alliance. Neither man had imagined, during that firefight in Khe-Sanh, or the decades of separation that followed, that they would one day work toward the same goal of transforming systems that had served one while failing the other. When the hearing concluded, James found himself surrounded by younger veterans, eager to express gratitude for his advocacy. Among them was Michael Taylor, a 34-year-old Afghanistan veteran who had nearly lost his housing before connecting with the Wilson Center. "You changed the game for all of us," he told James, the simple acknowledgement carrying the weight of generational impact. Outside the hearing room, reporters gathered for James's closing comments. "The real measure of today's proceedings won't be words spoken, but actions taken," he told them. "Our country has a long history of acknowledging injustice without actually correcting it. This time must be different." As the crowd dispersed, James found himself alone with Bennett briefly in the hallway. "I never expected to be here," Bennett admitted, gesturing to the Capitol surroundings. "Working to dismantle what I helped build." James studied the man who had once held power over his fate, now humbled by truth, but finding new purpose in accountability. "The systems were here before both of us," James observed. "They'll be here after we're gone, unless enough people decide they shouldn't be." The exchange captured the essence of their unlikely connection. Not friendship or reconciliation in any simple sense, but a shared commitment to ensuring that future veterans would not experience the divergent treatment that had defined their lives. That evening, James stood at the Lincoln Memorial, the illuminated monument reflecting in the still water of the reflecting pool. He had requested this detour before returning to Atlanta, wanting to revisit the site where Martin Luther King Jr. had spoken of dreams deferred but not abandoned. As he stood in contemplative silence, James reflected on how his individual case had become something larger, a catalyst for addressing injustices many had resigned themselves to accepting as unchangeable. The bronze star on his lapel caught the memorial's light, no longer hidden inside his coat, but displayed as both decoration and declaration. It symbolized not just his service in Vietnam, but his longer, harder battle on American soil, fighting systems designed to recognize some veterans' humanity while diminishing others. The next morning, as his flight departed for Atlanta, James gazed down at the Capitol receding below. The city had witnessed countless promises made to veterans. Throughout American history, some kept faithfully, others broken repeatedly along racial lines. The legislation bearing his name represented another such promise, its fulfillment not guaranteed, but its potential for genuine transformation greater than any that had come before. What James Wilson had achieved was not merely personal vindication, but the possibility of systemic change, not just for himself but for generations of veterans whose service deserved equal recognition regardless of race. His journey from homelessness to congressional testimony, from invisibility to influence, offered a powerful reminder that justice delayed need not be justice forever denied, and that systems of inequality, however entrenched, could still be transformed when their mechanisms were finally exposed to light. What do you think about James Wilson's extraordinary journey from a homeless veteran to someone who changed the system? Has his story changed your perspective on how America treats veterans of different races? If you believe all veterans deserve equal treatment, regardless of race, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to hear more powerful stories about everyday heroes making a difference. What changes do you think are still needed to ensure true equality for all who serve? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you know a veteran who struggled with the system, share this video with them, so they know they're not alone. Thank you for joining me for this incredible true story of perseverance, recognition, and long overdue justice. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on the battlefield, but in standing up for what's right when you return home. James Wilson's story teaches us that systemic racism often operates not through explicit policies, but through countless neutral decisions that collectively produce vastly different outcomes based on race. When two veterans who earned identical medals faced drastically different futures, one becoming a judge while the other experienced homelessness, the dividing factor wasn't merit, but rather how America's institutions treated them differently because of their skin color. True justice requires more than individual recognition. It demands transforming the systems that create inequality. The journey from Bennett's courtroom to congressional testimony illustrates how change often begins with a single moment of recognition, when hidden truths are finally exposed to light. We learn that accountability without repair is insufficient, and that institutions resist change until forced to confront their own contradictions. Perhaps most importantly, Wilson's perseverance reminds us that dignity isn't something others can take away. It resides in knowing your own worth even when systems refuse to acknowledge it. His decision to finally display his Bronze Star publicly symbolizes the transformation from private dignity to public recognition, from individual struggle to collective action. The medal, once hidden inside his coat, becomes a powerful symbol of both military service and the longer, harder battle for equality on American soil. What systems in your own community might be creating different outcomes for people based on their race or background? Have you ever witnessed someone being treated differently because of who they are? If James Wilson's story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of justice and transformation. Share this with someone who needs to understand how systemic discrimination operates. Sometimes, the most important conversations begin with a shared story. Do you know a veteran who has struggled with getting the recognition or benefits they deserve? Tag them in the comments below. What do you think would have happened if James had never removed his coat that day in court? Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes. Comment recognition. If you believe everyone deserves to be seen for their true worth regardless of race. Thank you for joining us for this powerful journey from injustice to transformation. Remember, change begins when we refuse to accept systems that treat some people as less valuable than others.